Okay, so in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about open pedagogy. I guess probably should define that. And basically, the idea of open pedagogy is that instead of students passively consuming academic content, they're actually creating something. They're creating something that has some value that lives beyond the course. And typically, open pedagogy projects are shared publicly. Although you probably, if you're offering an open pedagogy project in your class, you might want to give students the option of not sharing it publicly if they're worried about having content posted on the internet. You know, if they're worried about their personal privacy, if they're dealing with problems with other people who may be abusive and so forth, people will often not want to share things publicly. Or another option is to allow students to share things anonymously or with a pseudonym. But most of the time, open pedagogy projects are shared, at the very least within the class, but typically beyond that. One of the nice things about open pedagogy is it does involve active learning because students are actively engaged in creating something that has some value beyond just a classroom assignment. And one of the nice things about it, and this is a term that was first coined by, I believe, David Wiley, who's the founder of Lumen Learning and was one of the people extremely active at the very beginning and still is of the OER movement and open pedagogy movements. And so students create something that just doesn't go into a Dropbox in the LMS that they never see again after the class is over. Because so often students would write a paper, it would go to the professors at the end of the term. Sometimes they get it back, sometimes they wouldn't. You know, they may have saved their own digital copies of it. But with open pedagogy projects, they can live on long after the class is done. And if the material is public, it's something that students can share. They can share with their family members, they can share with potential employers, they can share with their friends as evidence of the type of work that they can do. And that gives it just a little bit more intrinsic value than the typical assignments where only the instructor sees the work often. It often involves some component of service learning. We'll talk about some examples where service learning is part of the process. So some examples in a very broad sense, and we'll look at some more specific examples, is to annotate online content using hypothesis or perusal or something else, where you can just create annotations to it to add to the material that's there. And those annotations, if you're using a hypothesis, say with an account outside of the LMS, can be shared publicly. And you can share those resources as collections and other things. Blogs are another example of an open pedagogy project that they haven't been quite as popular in the last few years as they were a decade or so ago, but it does give students a chance to chronicle their experiences. One of the cases where I've been seeing this quite a bit more recently is when classes are doing field trips or when students are doing study abroad programs or something like that, or if a class is doing some type of field event or study abroad event where students will blog their process. But blogs could be used in any classes. A number of people use them in writing classes where students write about their experiences, write about the interactions, and track their learning. So they can be used partly to build metacognition as well. Wikis are another type of a project that are sometimes used. I had used one of these many years ago when I was I was teaching a course in the history of economic thought. And there's a lot of really good textbooks out there, but they're generally like $150 or $200 or so. And pretty much all of the primary sources that they excerpt from are openly available on the internet. So I had students create wikis where I provided a list of topics that we would have covered there. I had a list of assigned readings, and I had students go out and analyze those and write blog entries about each of the economists, what their contributions were, the importance of it, the relevance, how it fit into the historical context, and how it connected to other work that came before it and the times that they were in. And students found that really engaging. I had each student do that. I think it it was 3 or 4 times over the course of the semester, where they first picked a topic. I think it was 3 times, where they first picked a topic or a school of economic thought in the first third of the course, another one in the second, and another one in the third. And I filled in some of the other materials, and we did some discussions for some of the groups or schools that were left out because we just didn't have enough students to cover all the topics. And then students gave short presentations on those. And that was free. And it was, again, a much more active way of students interacting with the materials. And instead of just seeing something as a summary, they got to put together their own summary and put it into context. So that worked really well. And I know there have been lots of cases where students have done this. Wikipedia has there's a WikiEDU project where you can sign up and get some training where they provide assistance and so forth in creating wikis. One of the more interesting cases I remember hearing about on a podcast was a group of students were studying Portuguese, and they were, I believe, in Texas. And what they did is they looked at Portuguese language wikis that had some entries about their communities or their cities and so forth. And they went in and they edited that, and they were editing in Portuguese, describing their cities, their communities, and other things that were relevant, that they had more information about. But at the same time, they're working on expressing themselves in a language where they're also getting some feedback, because these were public wikis where other people might critique them or might suggest changes and so forth. And there's lots of really good examples of wiki projects out there. Another thing that some groups have done is have students, or some classes have done, is have students create glossaries. We had someone in the theater department about 6 or 7 years ago who was teaching a course on Shakespeare. And she had the students create a glossary of some of the common terms that were used in Shakespeare that are not part of the common everyday use of English today. So they, again, created a nice resource there so that could be shared with other people studying Shakespeare in the future. Podcasts have been a popular topic for open pedagogy projects. I've had students do that in my online introductory economics class for a number of years, and also in my online labor economics classes, where they've created a couple of podcasts working with some of their colleagues in the class. And one of the things that both concerned them a little bit and also they found really beneficial for the most part was that typically in an online class, they don't do a lot of small group projects, or at least not with synchronous interactions. But the podcasts were generally kept to 2 or 3 people. And usually it's possible for 2 people to find some time during the week to get together they could always work collaboratively in planning things out. But when they actually recorded it, they really only needed a half an hour to an hour of synchronous time to record it. And that worked out pretty well. A couple of people had work schedules or just were really apprehensive about that. I allowed them to do their own individual podcasts, but I encouraged them, if possible, to find other people. And the way I had that work out in class was to have a discussion forum where people would list the topics that they were interested in, and also the times when they might be available to meet with someone else. And that worked pretty nicely because, everyone had to do something on this line, and it was much more enjoyable for them to talk to other people. And that was especially valuable and was really valued highly by students during the pandemic when all classes were remote. And, they said it was the first time they really got to talk to other students directly, even though they were taking an online class. They got to know other students in the class more, and they shared it with the class. And about half of them were willing to share their podcast publicly. So they got posted publicly as well as being shared with their classmates. One of the reasons why some of the people didn't have their podcast posted was because they were talking about problems with their employers or labor economic issues related to their employment, where they didn't want to have that information going out more broadly. Video projects are another common source of project. One thing that many faculty members have done in terms of open pedagogy projects is to have students in their class create videos that could be used by high school classes or by other college classes explaining certain topics. I remember hearing a podcast, I think it was in Teaching in Higher Ed a few years back, where there was someone teaching chemistry who, for every module in the class, students created videos demonstrating the concept at a level that was appropriate for a high school chemistry class. Um, Student research projects are another area where work can be shared. Now, that can also be a little problematic in that I've ended up getting some papers that students found on the internet from other students submitting them at other colleges, sometimes forgetting to remove information about the names of the college or whatever. But in any case, it does provide a nice sort of resource that can be shared. And if students are going to do some interesting research, sharing it online, again, gives it more of a sense of value. Student book projects. In my capstone class, I've had, I think now 5 or 6 books that students have created. In, I think it was 5 out of the last 6 years. They chose, one other year, they chose to do podcast projects instead. And that's been an interesting project. I got the idea from that at a SUNY CIT conference when Robin DeRosa was presenting on how her class created a book. She was teaching a course, I believe it was in early American or American literature or early American literature. And the standard text for that was a Norton's Guide, which was fairly expensive. And as she was leafing through it, she noted that that all of the work in there was actually available as open resources. They were all pretty much out there on the internet, available as well, they were already out of copyright. So what she had her students do is take a list of she had put together a list of readings, and she had her student create annotations for that, because the real value of something like Norton's anthologies are the annotations and the comments and so forth. And she had her students create them themselves instead of relying on someone else. So they were more directly engaging with it, with the work, with the primary sources, and trying to put it into context and so on. And they had peer review and discussions and so on. And I've had students do similar things. I don't have them annotate existing work. I've had them create their own, where they essentially either, depending on which version of the class it is, they either summarize research, do literature reviews on topics, or they may do some original research, depending on whether it's for the mathematical economics major or for economics majors who won't have quite as much quantitative skills or training for the course. And they've really enjoyed it. And one of the things that students have said, and we've got a podcast recording the first time I did this, is that the students said things like, my parents always wondered what I was learning, and now I can show them. And others said, I can put this on my LinkedIn profile and share this with potential employers so they can see the type of writing that I'm able to do. And, they found it really engaging. They were a little apprehensive at first, but they really ended up enjoying the process and enjoying the fact that they had something to show for this after the semester was over. It wasn't one of those disposable assignments like the type that typically get submitted into the LMS. So a few things to consider, that you shouldn't do an open pedagogy project just for the sake of doing it, because even though it's fun, it should be something that's aligned to your course learning outcomes, that they're actually learning something by the process. That should be obvious, but I've seen some projects where it's not always clear how closely aligned the projects are to what we really hope students would learn. Student privacy concerns should be taken seriously. And I mentioned before, a common practice is to give students, unless it's some sort of group project where people are working in groups and most of the people want it to be shared and 1 or 2 doesn't, it's generally good to give students the option of opting out of sharing something publicly. That's pretty easy to do with paper assignments, with podcasts and other things, where you can still share what they've created in the course, but just not share it on the open web. Or again, you can always give students the option of having the work posted anonymously or under a pseudonym if they're concerned about the privacy of their work. So, pseudonyms, anonymity, or an opt-out option where they can do something equivalent that's not going to be shared are usually the ways of dealing with it. Now, having said that, in the 6 years I've done this, I've never had a student, at least in the book project, not want to have their work shared. With the podcast project, as I said, a lot of people were uncomfortable with sharing it, either because they're not comfortable with their voice, or they were concerned that something they said might be used against them at some point in the future. I mentioned a wiki project I had done earlier. I did have a Russian student in class once who chose to write about Marx, and his comments about Marx were not this was a while back, but they were not particularly positive, and he did ask that that be taken down at the end of the semester. And one of the things, by the way, I did tell the students when I did the wiki project was that I know a lot of people who are doing work in the history of economic thought, and I said I'll have them look at your wiki post and make some comments. And that made them a little more apprehensive, but it also resulted in much higher quality work. When students know that other people might be looking at this stuff, maybe some experts in the field, it tends to spur them on to a little bit more effort and somewhat higher quality work. And I did have some friends who are working in the area come in and post a few comments here and there just to reinforce that. It's really helpful to have a student collaboration plan, that if students are going to be working in groups, and often those are the best way to do these types of projects, have each group come up with some sort of plan for how they're going to collaborate. When are they going to meet? Are they going to meet synchronously? Are they going to meet asynchronously? Will they be using Google Docs to store it, where they all have joint editing tools and so forth? And also to divide up the tasks in some way. Who is going to do the initial writing or the initial creating? Or who is going to be doing the research, picking up or looking into specific topic? How are they going to allocate the writing of the scripts or the other materials? And who is going to, in the case of a book project, how are they going to make it sound like, if it's 3 people writing a chapter, let's say, how are they going to make it sound as if it's all on one voice and not 3 things that would just tape together? So you suddenly hear this change in tone from place to place, and get them thinking about those things early on and making plans to address that so that they can work smoothly. And periodically, it's really good to have a group processing session where you have students, if you're meeting synchronously with the students, just get together with a group for a few minutes and talk about what's working well, what's not working well, and what they can do to be more successful. Because there's always some cases where someone may be slacking off a little bit, and it's a nice time to get those issues resolved. And also, these projects can be a lot of work. Generally, they're pretty heavily scaffolded. And, since they're out in public, the students themselves and as instructors, we'd like them to look fairly good. We'd like them to be fairly high quality. And so you should come up with some plan to provide both peer and instructor feedback and a process for revision. With the podcast, I have it done in 3 stages, basically, where first they submit a proposal for the topic to make sure it does align with what we're learning at that point in the course. And then also I have them, and as part of the, well, actually, I guess there's 4 steps. The first is submitting a proposal. The next step is submitting either in a detailed outline or a script. And the third is they submit a draft version of it. And the fourth is they submit a final version of it. Having said that, I give them feedback at each stage, and both for the first draft and for the final draft, they can resubmit it as many times as they need, if they want to, because they do get a score on it. And if they mess something up and the score was a little lower than they might like, they have the opportunity to go back and redo it, re-record that or re-edit it so that it is a bit more accurate, for example. With the book project, I just had something similar, but they submit a draft chapter and then they provide feedback to each other in groups. So each group would provide feedback to the work of of 3 of the other groups, and then that would cycle around. So everyone provided feedback on every other component of that in those cases. But you want to have these projects where the students are getting feedback throughout every step of the way. And There we go. You This is a good time in these projects at the beginning to remind students about copyright and intellectual integrity issues. And I probably should have put a note up here about AI, that, you should come up with some policy about how AI is going to be used and how it's going to be cited, whether it should be used, for what purposes should it be used. And having that as a discussion with students is really important. I have found that issues of academic integrity and copyright have generally been much less severe, well, other than potentially the impact of AI, in cases where there have been open pedagogy projects, because students know that their work is going to be posted publicly. And if they submitted the work of someone else might end up finding that work. And it generally, I've only had, I think, in those 5 years, 6 years I've been doing this, really only 2 students who were essentially plagiarizing work from papers or other things. And generally that was resolved pretty quickly with a bit of a conversation. AI is going to be a bit more of a challenge. So we'll see how that goes, but that's an issue for everyone in higher ed these days. Another thing is, and this will show up a little bit when we switch over to these resources I put together with a colleague. It's really good, if you want this work to be publicly shared, to have some sort of plan for publicly sharing it, and one that's sustainable. One of the things that happens is that students do like having their work out there, but a problem is that many of the platforms on which this work could be posted might go away, or when faculty move to a new place, it may disappear. So it's really good, to let students know that maybe this won't be there forever, but give students some indication of how long the resources will be there, and coming up with a plan to make sure that before you get too far along in this, that there's some way of hosting it so that it can be shared in a manner that's not terribly costly. For the podcast project I've had my students do, for about 6 or 7 years now, I've been paying for a hosting platform. I'm not sure I'll be willing to do that in another decade or so, but so far I've been able to do that. And other stuff has been posted on Pressbooks. Pressbooks used to be free to anyone. Now it's remarkably expensive. However, there is a SUNY Pressbooks system that you can get an account on for open pedagogy and other projects. So that's where their last book project ended up being posted. And those things can exist for quite a while. One of the things you should also do this is true for any group project, is find some way of assessing, providing individual accountability, some way of evaluating individual contributions. And one of the ways that I've done this was a suggestion based on someone from SUNY Buffalo who had done a similar project, was to have students working in Google Drive and just assign a color to each person. So one person would colors that had sufficient color contrast for accessibility, of course, but someone would be writing in dark blue, someone would be writing in a dark red, someone would be writing in a dark green or something similar. Typically there were 3 people, maybe occasionally 4. So they all picked a dark color for their own contributions. So it was easily visible exactly who had written which parts of which document. And at the end, of course, that all got wiped off and changed into, the one solid color. But it made it a little bit easier to visually see what the contributions of each student. Now, of course, in Google Docs, you could always look at the revision history, which is what I initially started doing. And that was just really tedious when you have 30 to 40 students doing this. But with the color things, it's pretty easy to skim through and look at that, and to provide individual feedback to the students themselves. So you don't have to just provide group feedback about the writing. You could, talk to the student about issues where they could perhaps improve their work, or, what they're doing well, and where there's some gaps in their logic or their analysis. And of course, accessibility with Title II now coming into effect. That is even more important, because student work that is shared with other students or publicly has to meet federal accessibility standard and state accessibility standards. Casey, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's coming. But in reality, there are many little things that if you just build into your habits and student habits that greatly improve the accessibility. Certainly, there are some very complicated situations that might arise, but there's really the 5 principles that we always talk about take care of the vast majority of it.
And this was something I've always talked about with these projects. And one of the things we do early on is we come up with a template for if it's a book project, we come up with a template for it, where we talk about the heading structure, we talk about the levels, we talk about how many levels they want, whether they just want A and B level heads, or maybe A, B, and C level heads. So it's standard. And then as a group, we create a standard template that then is shared as a in Google Drive with the copy in place of the edit review at the end. So they just click on it, they get a template that already is set up with a heading structure built in, and all they have to do is continue on with that and put in their own specific headings and so on. So, there would be an example of, it would say heading 1, heading 2, and, as text with the appropriate style. And then there would be subheading or subheading 2, subheading 3, and so forth. And they just copy that down and replace it and fill it in with whatever they were using. But they were getting information about that. And they were also reminded to put in tags for anything they had, and we checked that and so on. And they learned a bit about accessibility as part of this project. And then in terms of licensing, most open pedagogy projects are licensed under some Creative Commons term. And these are the common ones out there. And if you want more information on it, you can just click on the creativecommons.org/licenses to describe it. They have little code you can embed that will display the license information. And I always gave students the option of what type of license they wanted. And so far for the book projects, they've all chosen CC BY. So basically, if anyone uses any of their work, then they just have to give them credit. They've joked a little bit about perhaps putting in a non-commercial use or something, because they're worried that perhaps someone will make a movie out of their book. But generally, they're pretty willing to share, and they'd be pretty thrilled if anyone else wanted to use some of their work with attribution. And then there we go. I guess we could open that. Any questions in general at this point? Casey, have you done any open pedagogy projects?
I really haven't. I've considered it. I just haven't taken the plunge with other things going on to go there. There's a couple of us in the department now that are starting to think about some OER activities, and it's just a matter of whether we're doing them, whether we're doing them in collaboration with students, or how we go forward. But I think the time is coming.
Mm-hmm. Students love them in general, or at least my experience is that students have really found it enjoyable. So, Leah, do you have any?
Yeah, so just a question. So, and you probably said this, John, what level students have you worked with this? Or I mean, or do you know that others
Pretty
have
much all. For the
Okay.
podcast project, I've been doing it in online introductory economic class, which is mostly freshmen with a few sophomores.
Ooh, okay.
And for the capstone, they're pretty much all seniors. So, and the labor economics class, they're typically sophomores or juniors, because they've had to have had at least a couple of economics classes before they can take that. So pretty much I've used it. The podcast projects I've used at basically all levels of college. For the book projects, it's pretty much been only at the senior level.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Now, I did put together, actually, Judy Littlejohn and I gave a presentation on this a few years ago at OLC, and we put together a website for this. It was also in support of a SUNY Open Pedagogy project that we were both on. And if you aim your camera at that little dinosaur there, or if you type in tinyurl.com/open pedagogy resources with the capital letter for each of the words, which is also an accessibility issue in terms of URLs. It will take you to a resource, and the resource is going to open up here. And one of the things that I discovered, I haven't updated everything, is that so many of the resources we had listed that were active even a year ago are no longer there. So that issue of sustainability is kind of nice. Or is kind of important. Sometimes they've moved just to a new platform. I've updated probably about 10 or 12 of the links early this morning because I was late posting other things last night. There will be some broken links in here, and I just haven't had a chance to replace them. But for each of these examples, I've attempted to provide some examples of projects in them and some resources. For example, for blogs, here's some blogs that were created by students in some of the classes at Vanderbilt, because back when Derek Ruff was there, they were doing a lot, as the director of the teaching center, they were doing a lot of blog projects. And when I get time, I'll add some more. But those are all kind of nice. It shows you how students can use blogs to examine their learning, to reflect on their learning process or as part of the learning. And there's some resources there where, for example, there's a teaching with blogs at Vanderbilt University, which is still there. They've been gradually removing. Vanderbilt used to have the best collection of resources in support of teaching, but they had a new provost. They lost pretty much all their staff. And they've been dismantling those resources gradually. They were all released under a Creative Commons license, so a lot of them are appearing on other sites, but a lot of the Vanderbilt stuff is disappearing. But this is still there as of this morning. Okay, so yeah, so here's some examples on how to do it, or how you might teach with blogs. And here's a podcast we did with Danica Savoca at Cortland, who talked about her projects with blogging, and so forth. The kind of fun thing is collections. One of my favorites is this fashion history timeline at FIT. This has been an ongoing project they've been doing for about 6 or 7 years now. And each year, what students will do is they will create the history of fashion, where they take a different time period, or a different style, a different genre, and they take works of art and they do some analysis of it and so forth. And you can see, and here's like the 2010 to 2019, 1995, the Fez and the Ottoman Path to Modernity, and that they're all nicely tagged, and there's just a lot of really great material in there, which is a kind of nice way of having students learn a little bit about the history and evolution of fashion. And there's more added to this site every year. There's some essays. You can sort it by time period. As you can see, they've got a pretty wide range of time periods. There's a number of essays here. The dictionary. Okay, they did provide the dictionary describing various terms that might not be familiar to many of us. And here's some examples of designers. So it's a really, really nice source, or a really nice example of an ongoing open pedagogy project that can be expanded on an annual basis. And the Baltimore Uprising 2015 archive project was, again, a fairly nice example of this. There was the Appalachian Oral History Project interviews from 1965 to 89 are all available as a collection online. I know I don't have access to this yet, but Jessamine Newhouse from SUNY Plattsburgh just gave a presentation at the American Historical Association meetings 2 weeks ago about a project she had students do in Plattsburgh, where they were taking pictures of older historic homes, and they were writing a little bit about the history of that as a collection, as an open pedagogy project. And again, here's some resources on that. Here's a background of the fashion history timeline, and also how you might engage students in oral history project, which is a really great example in many disciplines, certainly in history, in perhaps in communications, in terms of interviewing techniques, perhaps in sociology and so on, where students go out and they interview people, and then they post the interviews or summaries of those interviews online, again, with appropriate permissions from the people they're interviewing. And those can be really nice sources. And we certainly have a lot of them in the National Archives, for example, where there's all these recordings of old Appalachian music or blues musicians and so forth, sometimes with interviews of them that would otherwise be completely lost without some of the oral history projects that have been done. E-portfolios, pretty much all the ones I had here disappeared. I did find one example here with student e-portfolio samples at the University of Florida. They tend to go away pretty quickly, but here, well, this is a guide that actually didn't belong there as a, well, yeah, that's list. I guess I didn't find any example, but here's some, these need to be reversed. So I replaced them, but I replaced them in the wrong place, but they're both there. The examples of glossaries, here's one at SUNY Cortland. The one that was done here in the theater department was at one point supposed to come out as a LibGuide, a live guide or whatever. But it never seemed to come together. But it was a great project for students, but it never got that far. Here we go. Maya Brown was a person who had done that project, and she did a podcast about how students created that glossary. And there's, again, a podcast interview with Danica about how she created one for literary studies projects. And, here's some examples of student podcasts. Vanderbilt, again, back when Derek Bruff was running the teaching center, had a whole series of class podcast projects going on. And each class picked the best podcast they had produced, and they put it into a competition where there were a panel of people who voted on it. And the best podcast from each of the and they created a Vanderbilt series that was a public podcast that contained the best student podcasts from the classes that were participating in the project. That's mostly gone offline, but the podcasts that they created are still there. We had one here, the Voices of Oswego Veterans Project, which was done by, I believe, people in 3 departments. Rebecca Mascher was working on it from graphic design perspective. There was someone in the writing center who was involved with it. There was also a photographer involved in it. So they interviewed students who were veterans in Oswego to talk about their experiences as a veteran and how it may have differed from other students and what special, what concerns they had, what things were working well, and some of the challenges that they might have been facing, and so forth. So, as well as just describing their lives in general and their pathway to coming back as a veteran. It was a great project, and it was all available online, and it went away. But there is an article about it there, and there are some quotes from it and some of those resources. Remixing and annotating online content is another thing that can be done, service learning. Some really good examples. Some of the best examples are some that are done by the National Archive and Smithsonian, and also the Indiana Library has this, where handwritten documents are being, now AI is doing more of this now than it once was, but in any case, they are using volunteers to convert handwritten materials into digital materials. And that's a really great service learning type project, where students are transcribing this stuff. And again, even if AI is being used, students could also be used to perhaps verify the translations, the transcriptions. But there's many others that students can do. Student created ancillaries. I don't think, they had all gone away. The ones that I had there had disappeared. But here's some examples or descriptions of some resources in creating these. And again, that's why that sustainability part is really kind of nice. You'd really like to see these things lasting longer. I think I only put in one of the student books that my students created. It was, I think, the first one. Yeah, it was probably the first or the second one they did. And again, that's hosted on Pressbooks. And this is back when Pressbooks were free. You can no longer edit those free ones, but you can still continue to use them. And if you go here, you can see, it was kind of nice. It was a little description of how this got started. And if you go over here, there's a contents. There were 3 parts to the book, one on trends in income inequality and intergenerational mobility. Another thing addressed causes of income inequality and intergenerational mobility. And the next was consequences and remediation. So here they talked about changes in tax and transfer payment structures, government programs. They talked about the impact of international trade, technological change, economic discrimination, the rising skill premia, where the authors of each chapter were listed at the top, and they can link directly to this. So they have, again, a permanent, as long as Pressbook continue to host these things, they have this material out there they can link to. And they did a pretty decent job with it. This was more of a literature review than actually original research, but it's a work of 3 people, and they were doing other things in class too, but this was a substantial portion of the work. Probably 35 to 40% of the work in the class involved building this at various stages. And one of the things I discovered was that they ended up writing a lot less than you would have expected as a result of 3 people. And part of the issue is the challenge of collaboration. Part of it is that they had to spend so much time doing peer review there that they didn't have quite as much time as if they were only working on, let's say, a senior thesis type paper from beginning to end. But they also, I think, ended up doing a pretty decent job, and they really liked the way it came out, and they seemed to enjoy the fact that they had this shared final product. So this resource is out there, and I do have to update more of the rest, and I will try to update more of this. It may have to wait until after these workshops are over, but there's a lot of other things here. Here's a collection that Open Pedagogy Fact 2 group put together, a collection Twine containing some of the same types of things, some different ones. There's the Open Pedagogy Notebook, which was put together by Robin DeRosa and a psychologist who I don't remember his name. He goes by That Psych Professor on Twitter. He's done a lot of work with OER. Austin Community College has some good examples. The UN has some great examples of renewable assignments. Ed Beck, who is one of the tech support and instructional designers at SUNY Oneonta, has worked with a lot of open pedagogy projects that he links to. There is a SUNY Create system, which Oswego is one of the people who put together an IITG grant to have access to a reclaim services hosting, reclaim hosting. Basically to reclaim hosting sites, and we lost that. We're the only one of the people on the original grant that chose not to continue funding it, because I think it costs like $800 or $1,000 a year, but it did provide up to 50 users with access to basically a server that hosted WordPress, that hosted a whole host of other things, and it was used pretty heavily, but not enough apparently for it to continue to be funded. So we still see it at, I think now there's about 10 or 12 SUNY schools, but we're the only one that dropped out of that because we wanted, and again, budgets are tight, but there weren't enough faculty using it to make it, or for it to apparently to be continued. I was really disappointed with that, but here's some information on SUNY's work with open pedagogy. And here's some things. This was back with the task group. They had people collect examples and post them, and they automatically get posted on that form. And finally, and yes, losing SUNY Create was a sore subject for me, but there we go. And SUNY OER Services has some information in collaboration with SUNY Learning on creating open pedagogy projects. The only thing we still have access to that is the Pressbook site, and that's probably mostly as a favor to me because I was one of the people who wrote that grant that got it for all of SUNY. So it does require asking for permission to, to post on there, but so far they have given it to anyone who's wanted it. So we're not paying for it, but fortunately they're letting us share the benefits of the other SUNY schools who are still doing this. Okay, so that's kind of all I've got. Any questions or thoughts? I can stop the share.
No, I really like all of those examples. I'm gonna poke around in there just for funsies.
And there's many more. I just tried to find one or two examples for each of the things just to show how it has been used and to show that it has been used. But there's so many projects. They do disappear really quickly, unfortunately, but there's a lot of them out there. And I found it to be fun. And I so much more enjoy listening to student podcasts than reading the same sort of paper over and over and over again. And they often put more work into it, and because it's not something they normally do, it's something that creates a little bit more connection to the material, because if they struggled through a few drafts on writing a book chapter, or if they struggled through, multiple drafts on coming up with a script and so on, they end up knowing that material pretty well, and they tend to be pretty proud of the work, which is something that doesn't always happen with papers or exams or other things that we use to assess student learning.
John, how many students have you had doing the podcast type of thing that have come back and said, that was way more work than I thought it was going to be?
Probably a third to a half of them. But I've also had probably 10% say, I'm going to create my own podcast now because I saw how much easier it was than I thought. And in fact, what I do at the beginning, because I know there's going to be some anxiety that it will be more work, I do a little survey, and it's kind of structured now, and the results are the same every year. The survey asks them, what concerns, it's just a simple question. What concerns do you have about this project? And what they always say is, I don't know if I know how to do this. I don't know if I have the hardware that's needed to do this. I don't know if I have the technical skills to do it. And so I'll address all that. I'll, give them some information about different ways they can record things. I'll say, if you're doing this in person, you look at your smartphone, you've got some recording apps on there. Pretty much both Android and iOS ones have built-in recording software. And I said, and I give them, and I also say, well, if you have Chrome, you can use this. If you're using a Chromebook, you can use this. If you're using a laptop, you could use Audacity or something else. And I'll give them a list of various tools, along with some links on how to record and edit with those tools. And then I'll give them a little assignment. And the assignment is, there's a number of podcasts in economics that are typically between 8 to 15 minutes long. They're short weekly messages. Sometimes they come out a couple times a week. I'll ask them to go through those, pick one that they like, and then just to record an audio response to it, and then to upload their audio response into Dropbox, Actually, I use Google Drive for it. There's a number of reasons for that. One of the nice things is it generates a nice spreadsheet that when they submit their final project, it has all the information there, and I can use that to share it with other students in the class. But once they do that, they say, they see, well, it took me 10 minutes to do this. It wasn't really all that hard, and then I talk about some ways of recording to get somewhat better audio quality. If they were recording right next to an air conditioner or a fan, if it's in the summer, say you may want to step a little bit further away, or just turn that fan off for a few minutes. Or, if they're recording right next to a highway, say, maybe if there's some room in your apartment or your house, it's a little further away from the street, it might be a better environment, to do that. Common thing is I'll have if they're using a microphone, they'll have it too close to their mouth, and there'll be a lot of pops and other things. I'll say, just back it away a little bit more, or don't have the microphone in the direct path of your breath, so you don't get those plosives. But it's mostly minor stuff like that, and generally they adapt to it pretty quickly. They are concerned about the amount of work. They said many of them do say it is a bit more work than they thought in terms of editing and planning for it, but they also found it pretty valuable. So
I I've given for a couple classes, students completely open-ended, do whatever for this final project. And the ones that have done podcasts have almost universally commented, it was a lot more work than I thought it was going to be, but they had the choice to do that compared to a paper slide. You know, it was pretty open-ended what they generated.
Yeah, and that's a good way of doing it. It's a nice UDL approach to let students express it whatever way they're more comfortable. And it is a bit more work than writing a paper, but on the other hand, it's so much nicer. One thing I didn't mention that was that during COVID, when people were on lockdown, I do set, especially when I had 40 to 60 students in my online classes, which were not uncommon back then. You know, I did set some limits on the length. It was a small, in the rubric, it was a small share. I think it was like maybe 5 to 10% of the grade, but I did ask them to keep them to about 10, I think 8 to 15 minutes or something. And one of the podcasts was about 45 minutes long. And but so much of it was just students talking to each other, getting to know each other, and forming these connections, because they were just clearly so desperate to talk to other students that they weren't able to, because they were all working remotely. You know, even if they were, that was especially true for the students who were usually face-to-face students, but who were moved online in a way that they weren't really anticipating or planning to. So I ended up with much longer podcasts during that period, but they also appreciated them even more than they have at other times. And I should note that my upper level students appreciated them a bit more than the freshmen. There was a bit more mixed for freshmen, because they were already doing a lot of work, and learning economics is something that they often found challenging to begin with, you know, but they said it was valuable, but the workload was a bit more. Generally, that didn't happen so much with upper level students. So any other questions or comments?
No, this is great.
Okay, well, thank you. If you you know, I've done a lot of this stuff. If you ever have any questions, I'm happy to share any of it.
Right. Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Kristen.
I'm gonna go set up for mine, John.
Okay, I'll probably be over.
Hey, John, how are you doing?
Good. Did you come for this session or the next one?
The next one, I logged in early just to make sure my microphone was working.
Okay, good. Well, I do have to stop it for just a second, because that renders a video. Otherwise, we'd end up with the transcripts not synced with the video. So we'll exit and we'll right back.
Okay, sounds good.
But I got to stop the recording first. Sorry, I forgot about that. I'm new with this.